Welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past 35 years. Now, last week, a poll conducted by the Harvard Center for American Politics revealed that inflation was the number one issue that affected the people being polled, followed pretty closely by immigration concerns, because that's in the news. But crime and drugs came in a strong third place. Now, 5 to 10 years ago, crime didn't even really crack the top 10 list, and criminal justice reform was even further down the charts. How quickly everything can go off the rails. In the 2010s, I think it can be argued, criminal justice fell victim to the worst of all possible attacks: success. New York City had gone from the murder capital to the safest big city in the country. And as other cities adopted New York crime-fighting policies, crime dropped all across the nation. So as crime fell, the news stories increasingly became attacks on the police, particularly if those attacks could be viewed through a racial lens. And all other aspects of the criminal justice system were viewed as the problem, rather than the reason crime had dropped to such low levels. And this especially includes bail and pretrial release. The question was presented as, if crime is so low, why are the jails so full? The answer, of course, is that crime was low because the jails were full. But despite the obviousness of this equation, bail reform became a rallying cry for people who no longer remembered the bad old days of high crime. John Oliver even did a couple of misleading episodes on bail, and suddenly it was vitally important to eliminate a part of the criminal justice system that had been around for over 1,000 years. The state of New York jumped on the bail reform bandwagon in 2019 and significantly reduced the use of all forms of monetary pretrial release. So we're now almost 4 years into New York's bail reform experiment. How's it going? Is New York the new Shangri-La now that the evils of bail have been eliminated? Or is it suffering the predictable consequences of ultra-lenient pretrial release policies? Jim Quinn spent 42 years with the Queens County District Attorney and has a first-hand view of how this all played out and what the results have actually been. Mr. Quinn, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, give us a little bit of your backstory. I didn't give you a whole lot of background information there, 42 years with the DA's office, but tell us more about what you've done. How did you become a prosecutor? Give us your backstory.
All right. I became an assistant DA in 1977. I started in the Queens County District Attorney's Office. Queens County is a county in New York City of approximately 2.4 million people, so it's larger than most cities around the country.
Larger than a lot of states.
Yes, in a lot of states. I started in the Appeals Bureau, where we handled the appeals of convictions that the office had gotten. I argued in the Court of Appeals in New York State and the Appellate Division. I was a trial assistant. I was in the Investigations Bureau. I was in the Homicide Investigations Bureau. I was in the Rackets Bureau. I was deputy chief of the Homicide Investigations Bureau. I was chief of the Narcotic Trials Bureau back in 1991. And in 1992, I became an executive assistant DA. And in that capacity, I was in charge of the grand jury, the criminal court, the intake bureau, which is our complaint room where all the new cases come in. I was in charge of 5 Supreme Court bureaus, major crime, which is our career criminal bureau, and I was in charge of the hate crime bureau. And I did that for close to 30 years up until 2019, when I retired as an assistant DA on January 1st of 2020, just as the new bail laws were coming in. I was very much involved in my office's opposition to the bail laws and a lot of the criminal justice reforms that were coming in over the years between like 2016 to 2019, 2020 when I left. And I testified in before the City Council Committee on several bills. I testified before the Lippman Commission, which is about closing Rikers Island here in New York City. And, I've been studying this for quite some time and looking at it realistically to see what effect these laws would have on crime in New York City.
So basically, that was in the heyday. I mean, we could, if we wanted to say this, we could say that you're responsible for the 76% reduction in crime over that period of time there in New York City.
I like to think I'm part of it. Police department played a tremendous role, and the reforms that the police department made, the introduction of alternative sentencing programs into New York's criminal justice system played a big role. Tightening up the criminal justice laws back in the 80s and the early 90s played a tremendous role. And it's hard to believe, but like in New York City in 1993, in Queens County alone, the county of 2.4 million people, there were 50,000 cars stolen just in that 1 year in 1993. In 2019, that number had been reduced down to 2,500 from 50,000. It's a 95% reduction in car theft. I mean, it was amazing. Homicides went from 350 down to 76. Robberies decreased dramatically, and when you look at what was done in New York City between 1993 and 2019, nobody in their wildest dreams would have said that was possible, and New York City did it. And I think your remarks about the criminal justice system as a victim of its own success is right on the money.
Well, this would have also been in the heyday of, the kind of the more controversial policing tactics, the broken windows and stop and frisk, those sorts of things. I mean, that clearly did work, but there seems to be some pushback on those.
Well, I mean, there was a lot of pushback to stop and frisk, and in some ways, I mean, what it did was, while it might not have resulted in that many gun seizures, what it did was it stopped people from carrying their guns on the street.
Right.
And that was an amazing part of it. And what we're seeing now in New York, they're seizing a lot more guns. But it's because there are more guns on the street. They're making fewer arrests, actually, but seizing more guns. And it's because there are more people not leaving their guns at home, but bringing them out onto the street. And when that happens, that's when shootings rise and homicides rise and robberies rise. And that's exactly what happened. It's like a textbook analysis of what's going on in the city.
So what are you doing now? I mean, I know that you've written papers and sort of podcasts and stuff along that, but what are you doing in your retirement?
I'm like fully retired. I mean, I write articles for various papers. I'm involved with the Manhattan Institute here in New York City. I wrote a real in-depth study of New York's bail reforms and their impact on crime. I write not editorials, but op-eds for the Post and the Daily News and some local papers. And it's, I keep on top of things. I study this stuff constantly. And it drives me crazy. I mean, what used to drive me crazy back when I was in the DA's office, because I was an executive assistant, I used to go down to meetings at the mayor's office once a month. And Mayor de Blasio was the mayor at the time that I used to go to these meetings. And it's when all this bail reform and, criminal justice reform was starting to take place. And I go to a meeting and they talk about how they wanted to reduce the population of Rikers Island, which is a jail here in New York City.
Right.
We're going to do that by getting all the people who were charged with minor misdemeanors, like taking up 2 seats on the subway or possession of small amounts of marijuana or their first offense shoplifting. And I used to listen at these meetings, and then I'd go back to my office, and we had an enormous data file. We could run reports on anything. And I used to go back from these meetings and call our statistical people and say, I want a listing of everybody in Queens County, on a Queens County case, who's in jail solely for turnstile jumping. And they'd send me a report, and there were none.
Right.
And so how many are in there for misdemeanor, small amounts of marijuana? There were none. How many are there for taking up 2 seats on the subway? There were none. But New York City was basing their these reforms that they were promulgating based on just faulty information, and they had to know it was not true. We used to send them, our own reports and analyses of who was in jail. But they had to know that this was all wrong. And they had to know that what they were proposing was going to result in the release of not turnstile jumpers, but career criminals. New York City, crime went down in 70 to 80% from 1993. And the population of Rikers halved. It went from 22,000 to about 10,000, 9,000. So crime went down, and that propelled the reduction in the people who were being held in New York City jails. But they kept repeating over and over and over again that the criminal justice system in New York was broken and we had to fix it. And it was just not true. It could be, tinkered with. There were massive reforms that could be done, but what they did was just assume that everybody in jail shouldn't be there. And we have to get rid of as many people as we can. And what further fueled it was this massive PR campaign against Rikers Island, to reduce the population on Rikers Island. And, we have some of the most liberal judges in the United States, in New York City. I mean, they are 90% Democrats. They've been, appointed by liberals over the last, basically since Giuliani left,
right,
in 2001. And to claim that these judges are unfairly putting poor people in jail for minor crimes is just ludicrous on its face. And then when you look at the data, that the data just proves that was a complete lie, but it got repeated over and over and over and over again. And that caused a lot of people to be afraid to oppose the people who were pushing all these reforms.
It's the same argument that's made in states for like marijuana legalization. The argument that there are people languishing in custody for possession of small amounts of marijuana, and you just can't back that up with any sort of data. It just isn't there.
It isn't, and they're very good at that though. And back when they were talking about the Rockefeller drug laws here in New York, which were tough laws on drug dealers,
right?
They always used to talk about how all these people were in jail for possessing small amounts of heroin. And there were. But what they were there for, they were originally charged with sale and possession of heroin. They pled to possession. So on the books, they are listed as being in jail for possession of, 3 vials of cocaine. And they would say, look, all these people with small amounts of controlled substance are being held in jail, when in fact they were actually the people who were selling the drugs, and they were actually, most of them had prior convictions if they were up in state prison. So it's just that they control the narrative, and it just gets repeated over and over again until everybody believes it.
Well, a big part of the narrative, and this is probably not getting on topic on your report just yet, but it kind of sticks with us in the bail industry, was the Khalif Browder story. And I don't know how familiar with that you are or anything along those lines. My understanding was that Browder was arrested, and there's always this attempt to minimize it, that he was arrested for stealing a backpack or accused of stealing a backpack in what was actually a strong arm robbery or mugging. It wasn't just he found a backpack on the park. I mean, they actually robbed somebody. And that's another technique on, like you're talking about, managing the narrative, is minimizing the crime that was involved. I mean, this is not just a shoplifting charge. This was a mugging.
No, but the other thing about the Khalif Browder story that gets completely ignored is that he wasn't being held on $3,000 bail.
Right.
He had previously been convicted of another robbery, and he got what's called in New York a youthful offender treatment, which means he got probation, and he was out on that case on probation when he committed the second robbery, the probation department violated his probation. So even if he had the $3,000 bail, he couldn't have gotten out because there was a probation hold, and he was awaiting his probation hearing at the time that he got arrested on the second robbery. And what a lot of people don't realize is that, he committed suicide, but he committed suicide 2 years after he was released from jail.
Right.
And during that time, he had gone to college. He had actually turned his life around to some extent. And that all gets lost in the narrative. I think most people believe that he committed suicide while he was being held in Rikers on bail because his family couldn't come up with the money. And, that's the problem with anecdotal reform. They take one story, which is the worst possible story, and make it seem as if that's happening all over the place. And it's not. It's just not. Getting bail on somebody in New York, you have to be, for murder, of course, you go in, or, serious assault, the judges are going to set bail on you. But to be there even on a strong arm robbery for a first offense is very difficult to get. Burglary can be very difficult to get. They're not putting people in on everything. So the people who were in were serious criminal offenders.
Well, if I recall in the Browder case, his bond was $3,000 for a strong arm robbery. I mean, and that, in my area, a strong arm robbery is going to be much, much higher than $3,000.
Well, this is a guy, and not only did he commit a strong arm robbery, but he did it while he was out on probation for another robbery.
Right.
So, to claim that New York is harsh on criminals was ridiculous. So I think that to some extent we had found the right match of everything, of being strong and also being understanding. We had brought crime down to such an enormous degree. I mean, for the first time in my life, I would park my car on the street, and sometimes I wouldn't leave it locked. I would leave it unlocked and walk away. I can't do that anymore. I mean,
you don't have a car.
But they catch a narrative, they repeat the narrative, they make the narrative become the rule, and then they develop and devise legislation based on this narrative that is an exception and that isn't actually what they say it is. It's insane.
Well, and it's always that way. All of these stories that we see, and that are, arguments for bail reform. This is why we have to have bail reform. When you actually dig into them, one, they're outlier events anyway, and they don't hold up. And it's all, there was the California case, the California Supreme Court, held up. Well, the man stole $5 worth of perfume. Well, it was a home invasion robbery. It wasn't just he was shoplifting from some store. He broke into this guy's apartment, held him down. And yes, he chose the wrong person to steal from him. He was going to get something, but it's a serious violent offense,
Yep.
And then you go, well, he can't afford bonds, so you can't hold him.
Yeah.
It's just crazy. So politically, at the state level, I assume you guys were very much into that. How did this come to pass? You guys are right next door to New Jersey. You'd seen what happened in New Jersey. How did this manage to make it through the State House?
Well, it's an interesting story. It was they've had this bill around for years and years and years and years.
Right.
They had some other reforms too. That discovery reform, which is another disaster, but that's a topic of a whole other podcast. But they had all these other reforms that they've been trying to get passed. And this one had sat around for a long time. I think it was 2017, or 18, the state legislature was Democrat. And the state assembly has always been Democrat. It's 2-1 Democratic.
Right.
We've had a Democratic governor since 2001, I think. The state Senate had historically been Republican over the years. in, I think, 2016 or 17, it changed to Democratic hands. But there were a bunch of moderate Democrats who voted with the Republicans to keep the Senate essentially in Republican control. So these bills never got out of committee in the Senate. They were passed every year by the Assembly, but they never got passed in the Senate. In 2018, the Democrats who were siding with the Republicans were all primaried by the Democratic Socialist Alliance. They were very smart. They picked the people that they knew they could beat, and they spent a lot of money. They got funded from all over the country, and they beat almost every Democrat who was siding with the Republicans. So now the state Senate transferred to Democratic hands, and the people who were the elephants in the room were the Democratic Socialists. And so the Assembly passed this bill, the Senate now passed the bill, but it wasn't a standalone bill, because the way they were working things in New York, everything would be put into the budget.
Right.
So it was one vote. So if you didn't vote for this bill, you were voting against schools, against healthcare, against mothers, against children, and all this stuff. So they put it into this bill in like the middle of the night, and it actually passed on April Fool's Day of 2019. And we had no idea what was in it. And when I say we, I mean the prosecutors.
Right. Most
of the members of the state Assembly and the state Senate had no idea what was in it, because it was just thrown in into this massive, $200 billion bill. And it got passed. And then we started looking at it. We had never seen it before, because it was never taken seriously. And then everybody's saying, look at this. And, in the original bill, you couldn't set bail on a home burglary. You couldn't set bail on any drug case at all. You couldn't set bail on a strong arm robbery. You could not set bail, no matter what the guy's record was, no matter what his history was. Nothing. No matter whether it was in the country legally or illegally, that means nothing. It was the crime itself that controlled whether or not bail could be set. And we would go to some of our state legislators and say, do you know that this is in the bill? And they say, no, that's not in the bill. Yeah, here it is. And we'd show it to them and say, I didn't know that was in there. And so that got passed. And once it got passed, getting it changed required not only the state Senate to change it, but the Assembly, which was 2-1 Democrat.
Right.
The state Senate is now, right now, it's almost 2-1 Democrat also. So getting them changed, it's next to impossible. And they've, played around with it around the edges, but the bottom line is that the bill has been a disaster for New York State, crime-wise. And New York City, everything in crime-wise gets magnified in New York City now. It's a mess.
Well, that's a good segue here. So let's do talk data, because that's that's your strong point. That's the thing you've written up here. You wrote a paper for the Manhattan Institute titled "More Criminals, More Crime: Measuring the Public Safety Impact of New York's 2019 Bail Law." And anybody wants to see this, the report's available on the website of the Manhattan Institute. If anybody likes the Manhattan Institute, these books behind me are written by a couple of people that are fellows at the Manhattan Institute. For the longest time, they seem like the only the voice in the wilderness talking about the dangers of these things. I think it's catching on more and more, but that they're some of the original people looking at this. But now, given that your article starts off "More Criminals, More Crime," I'm guessing that bail reform was not a resounding success in New York.
No. I mean, as odd as it may seem, if you have more criminals on the street, you're going to have more crime. I mean, I don't know why that's even debatable. And what bail reform did, it became effective on January 1st of 2020. And what it meant was that there were certain crimes for which judges could not set bail. And they were all the nonviolent crimes, the car thefts, the grand larcenies, the petty larcenies. Originally, it was burglary, residential burglaries, strong arm robberies, any drug cases. So what happened was it didn't just apply to everybody who got arrested after January 1st. It applied to everybody who was in jail on bail on those charges. So on January 1st of 2020, or by January 1st of 2020, every single person who was in jail charged with car theft, burglary, grand larceny, petty larceny, drug dealing, a strong arm robbery, every single one of those people, if that was the only thing that was holding them was that they couldn't make bail, every single one of them was released by January 1st of 2020. And what the court system did, they realized that they can't just release 2,000 people in one day. So they started in November. The chief judge issued a memorandum saying you should start applying those bail criteria now.
Right.
And started releasing people, up until January 1st. So by January 1st of 2020, 2,000 people had been released from Rikers Island under the new bail law, just solely under the new bail law. And those 2,000 people, we did an analysis of them, which nobody else did. Not the legislature, not no commissions, no committees, nobody did. And those people had an average of 12 prior arrests, They had an average of 6 prior convictions. They had an average of 2 failures to appear on prior cases. And they were all released in one swell swoop. I mean, it was ridiculous. And so what happened was between January 1st of 2020, when all these people are released, up until March 15th of 2020, which is before COVID,
right,
crime in New York City went up 21% over the previous year. 21%. Now, it had gone down every single month in 2019. Every month. It had gone down almost every year for the past 27 years. Bail reform took effect on one day, and within 2.5 months, crime went up 20%. And it went up in car theft, it went up 68%. Drug dealing, drug cases went up. Grand larcenies went up. In every category where those people were released, crime went up. It didn't go up and didn't start going up in the homicides until later on in the year. And shootings went up a little bit, but not as much as they went up later on in the year. But all those crime categories had gone down every month in just the year before. So I don't understand how they can sit there and I listen to them constantly saying that bail reform had no impact on crime. I mean, that's just idiotic.
Well, I recall in March, before COVID really hit, there was a quote from Bill de Blasio saying, yeah, we really need to relook at this. There hasn't been any other changes. The only change that's occurred, that can be tied directly to this is bail reform. But of course, that was one quote one time, and then there was COVID, and then we could just kind of forget that I actually made that statement and push that under the rug.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that they all regret a lot of the things they said. I mean, I have a press release from 2017 where it's the mayor calling for judges to be able to remand people if they find them to be a danger to society and a danger to the public. And that press release was signed off on by Bill de Blasio, Eric Adams, who's the current mayor, Jonathan Lippman, who was the chairman of the commission to close Rikers Island, the speaker of the city council at the time. All of them were saying, yes, we have to allow judges to remand people. And that just died. I think they got so much blowback from the far left of the party here in New York City that they don't even talk about that anymore. And it's just, I don't know. They come up with reports and things like that are so misleading. And it's what drives me crazy. I read them and then I come home and I analyze the reports, and then I publish something showing how faulty their logic is and how faulty their data is, because it's just not true.
Well, and that was what I was going to kind of get into next here was, the old Mark Twain quote that there's, lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that, because I've looked at a lot of statistical reporting on bail over the years, and one of the main issues, I think, is that the people that are compiling the data and issuing the reports have an interest in the outcome. It's their program. They're the ones that either were politically responsible for getting enacted, or they're the ones whose job it is to do that. Well, then we put out this report saying what a great job we've done. And so then that data comes out and it sort of gets massaged to get the results most favorable for those who were responsible for the initial decision. So it sounds like you're saying that to a certain extent, some of this data is being manipulated in New York. How is that being done?
Well, I'll tell you, it's not to a certain extent; it's to a complete extent. I mean,
okay.
I'm serious. I have not seen a legitimate study of the impact of bail reform on crime, and I'll give you an example. The speaker of the you got to forgive me. I can't remember which one it was because there have been so many reports. But one of the talking points is that under bail reform, only 2% of the people on bail get rearrested for a violent felony while their case is pending. Okay, now there are a lot of qualifiers in there. I mean,
there are a lot of qualifiers.
2% of the people on bail get rearrested for a violent felony. Now, that doesn't include nonviolent felonies and misdemeanors.
Or any drug charge.
Or any drug charge. While their case is pending, which only takes the time from their original arrest until the case either pleads out or is dismissed. It doesn't include the time from plea to sentence, for one thing. It doesn't include any time after sentence. But, forget that. It's kind of like what they do is, if I were to ask you what the death rate from COVID is in the United States, there are different ways you come up with it. You figure 1 million people died in the United States. There are 330 million people in the United States. That's 1 in 330 people died of COVID.
Right.
But not everybody got COVID. So then you look, maybe half the people had COVID. So now the rate comes down to 1 in 165 people who had COVID died of COVID. And then you look at it, well, what about people with comorbidities? Well, then it increases the risk of death to a much higher degree. So you might have 1 in 40 people who were overweight or had asthma who got COVID, died of COVID. So now you're down from 1 in 330 down to 1 in 40. And if you talk about people who are over 80, well, 80% of them died if they had COVID. So right. What they do is they pick and choose their data. And what you really have to look at, you have to try to come up with a model that figures out, well, okay, who would have had bail set under the old law and been held in, who is now getting out, and look at the recidivism rate of those people. And the people who would have been held in under the old law would be people who had extensive criminal records or another pending case. That's the bulk of the people who would have had bail set. And when you look at those people and you look at particular crimes, people who had a prior case when they were arrested or a pending case when they were arrested, their recidivism rate for shoplifting, say, was 80%. For grand larceny, it's 50%. For burglary, it's 70%. Meaning that 70% of the people who would have had bail set, who are now out, get rearrested. And that's what's driving crime. Not everybody would have bail set. I mean, it's in New York City, 96% or 94% of the misdemeanor people who were arrested had no bail. They were ROR'd. 96%. On the felonies, it was only about a third. And those people who had bail set under the old laws were bad people, and that's why judges set bail on them. And but they are so invested in these reforms that they have to justify them, and they can't do it logically or realistically. so they come up with these numbers that are meaningless.
Well, another hypothesis that I've had on this is, even if those were 100% accurate, and so I mean, you'd say, okay, this is the only 2% of these people have committed new crimes. Crime is still going up, so something's causing that crime to go up. Whether it's those same people or, and I think it is those same people to a certain extent. But I think what you're also doing is you're creating what I refer to as a permissive environment for crime. In that, these people don't live in a vacuum. It's not, here's this one person that happens to get caught, another one doing all this stuff. There's a group of people, a circle that they move among, that these are the people that are involved in this sort of activity, this sort of theft, this sort of, auto theft, these sorts of drug charges. Well, Bob over there, Bob got caught and got back out in 5 hours. So maybe the consequences of doing this aren't so bad. And so you're basically sitting there, you're giving a green light to people who are inclined, or who move among a group of people who are inclined to do this. And they talk to each other. They know what's going on. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so, you are telling people, you're sending out a message that it's okay to commit these crimes, or at least there's no real consequence for committing these crimes.
Well, I mean, you can see it in New York City. I never, in all my years as an assistant DA, I don't think I ever saw these crash and steal mobs going into a store and just ransacking the place and running out with clothing and all sorts of things in bags. I don't think I ever saw that. And I was there for 42 years during the height of crime in New York City.
Right.
What happened is, you're absolutely right. When you take away the risk of something bad happening to you, either being held in jail or going to jail or getting arrested, you take away the risk of you take away the cost of doing business, basically. So, I'm out there, I see clothing that I want in a particular store, and I find out that there's a bunch of people who are going to go do it. Now, I wouldn't go there and do it myself. But if I know that there are going to be 10 people there and that the cops aren't going to be able to do anything and the stores aren't going to stop me because they're afraid of their people getting hurt, well, I'll go do it. And I'm never going to get caught. I'll wear a mask, because it'll look like it's COVID. You can go and do whatever you want. And you're right. Of course, people are going to do it. And when there's no risk to being held in jail, that's going to happen. But one of the main things that is pushing this stuff is, 70% of the people who get arrested for a felony in New York have a prior record.
Sure.
70%. And that's from the court numbers. We're not dealing with people stealing food to eat. I mean, that's just not, that doesn't exist. I mean, New York City has food pantries all over the place. There are free meals that the kids get at breakfast and lunch in schools every day. It's just, but our politicians keep justifying these things as crimes of poverty, and what are people going to do if they have to choose between rent and food? They'll pay their rent and steal food. I mean, it's ridiculous. It really is, and we've lost a sense of responsibility. I once said that if everybody in New York, if for some reason, if New York would have passed a law saying that every person in New York State was entitled to kill one person and get away with it. Now, most people wouldn't, but some people would, who wouldn't do it now. So it's the same impact when you start lessening the crimes, you start lessening the penalties, you start lessening the risk of being punished. It encourages people who would not ordinarily do that to do that, and that's the problem that we're having. And then when you have politicians creating a culture of, well, you can do that because you're a victim of society. The criminal justice system is unfair and it's racist and it's mean-spirited and all these things. Well, then people look at, I'm not going to respect the criminal justice system. It's racist, it's mean-spirited, it's unfair. And it's just, so that's, and you constantly demonize cops. And that's why people are resisting cops. And, I mean, in New York City today, I honestly don't know why a police officer would chase after somebody who's running away from him. The fact that they still do it, I mean, to me is like that is more power to them. I mean, God bless them that they do that. But I mean, they're going to run him, catch up to him. He's going to fight them. They're going to fight him. Somebody's going to come up with a video camera, and immediately there's going to be investigation into that police officer's conduct. And, it may all turn out all right, but it could take 6 months to clear.
Well, and it won't necessarily. I mean, that was sort of a question I had last podcast. We talked to the vice president of the FOP, and so we're asking him. He originally started off in New York and ended up in Texas. But it's like, so what has happened to policing in New York since bail reform? And are we seeing that same exodus of officers we're seeing elsewhere? I mean, I think bail reform and George Floyd sort of all kind of combined together to make things particularly rough on the police. But I know lots of places you're seeing police pick up and just go. I'm not doing this. I'm not playing this game anymore. I'm retiring. I'm quitting. I'm doing something else. As the same sort of thing. I mean, New York City is the largest police department in the country, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So, I mean, we're seeing an exodus there as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing retirement. You're seeing that there are less people applying for the job. I mean, I speak to cops who, that they're discouraging their kids from going into the police department. I mean, it always used to be, they would tell their kids to be there. You'd be working with generations of cops, and but now, we just passed another stupid bill that was the city council, the mayor actually vetoed it, and the city council overrode his veto. And it was to have cops, every time they interact with the citizen, essentially, they have to fill out a form they have to put down the apparent race and gender of the individual, why he was stopped, whether he was stopped because of a 911 call or a street encounter or whatever. So anytime a police officer goes to question somebody about a crime, he has to fill out this report. So, I may go up to you and say, I respond to a car crash. Did you see anything? No, I didn't see anything. Okay, I have to fill out a report. And and they say, well, it only takes a minute to fill out. Well, it doesn't. First of all, it doesn't. There's not a police department form in the world that takes a minute to fill out. And when do you fill it out? Do you fill it out right there while other witnesses are walking away, or do you wait till you get back to the precinct and then have to remember I talked to that guy? Yeah, and he was black, but the other guy he was Hispanic. No, this guy. You got to fill out all those stupid things. It's meaningless data because the cops are not going to fill it out completely. They're not going to fill out every one of these things because it's just an aggravation. And it's another thing for them to get flopped on.
Sure.
He didn't have his stop and frisk, his stop and question report. It's things like that make the cops think that there's a target on their back. I mean, and in New York City, we have so many different entities that investigate improper police behavior: the Civilian Complaint Review Board, IAB, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the DA's offices. Now the city wanted to set up a separate commission to look into the police department, and it's just the Attorney General, State Attorney General is looking into police officers, and these are all people with a liberal bent who are looking to settle scores with police officers. It's just I don't know why they're doing it. I think it's an ideological thing because it certainly doesn't impact the reality of life in the city, and it makes the cops more reluctant to do things that they have to do to prevent crime in New York City.
Well, yeah, if you say that you support community policing, well, then forcing them to document every last interaction they have with the community is probably going to have them pull back from that just as a matter of workload.
That's exactly right. And it's I don't know what the logic is, and it passed. New York City's city council is, I think it's 54, and I think they had 42 members vote to override the mayor's veto, and I think 9 people voted to uphold the veto. It's like you wonder what the logic is, and then you think, well, there is no logic. It's an ideological bent that prevents them from really looking at things logically. I mean, nobody has ever written to me about my report. I sent it to various groups. In my Manhattan Institute report, I sent it to various groups. I never heard back from them, which is, doesn't surprise me at all. I go to meetings. I talk about this stuff. I joke with my friends. I said, this is kind of like therapy for me. It's the only way I can keep my sanity. And, but I mean, there was so much data out there that you can look at and analyze. And, if you really want to do it, if you're not looking to prove a point. I mean, I started this by looking to see whether or not what they were telling me was true. And, I'd find out that it wasn't true. There weren't all these marijuana smokers in jail and turnstile jumpers in jail. And so then I started looking at it a little bit more deeply. Well, what's happening with crime? And I mean, I don't know. And what really is infuriating is, like, you look in New York City, 95% of the people who were shot in New York City are Black or Hispanic. That's the actual number. Sure. That's not somebody estimating it. That's from the NYPD's website. And 95% of the shooters are Black or Hispanic. 90% of the people murdered in New York City are Black or Hispanic. 76% of the robbery victims are Black or Hispanic. They are only 50% of the population. And our police department is 60% minority, but they keep repeating this I don't know, claim that the criminal justice system is racist against minorities, and it's just so.
I just don't know how you show solidarity for people of color by letting them be the victims of crime. I mean, and that's basically what's occurring here. You're saying, oh, well, unless it's an idea that, there's something in that, limousine liberal type mindset that, well, these people of color, they're all criminals. So if we do something that's, in theory, pro-crime, it's to help them because we're trying to, show solidarity with people of color, as opposed to really realizing that, people of color are the victims of these predators in their own community. And I know predator is not a word we're supposed to use anymore, but it's still, violent criminals in their own community.
I honestly don't know how some of these people sleep at night. But I will tell you the reforms the bail reform and, releasing people from jail was supposed to reduce the minority population in the city jails. It's actually increased it since they started this bail reform.
I think the same thing happened in New Jersey as well, that the racial disparity increased in those jails, even though the plan was supposed to reduce the racial disparity.
Well, I mean, it's a sad reality that the majority of violent crime is committed by minorities.
Right.
So if all you're going to leave in jail are violent criminals, you're going to have a higher percentage of minorities in jail. And, you have to honestly look at this stuff. You can't assume that every race commits crime at the same rate. So therefore, if the city is, 40% white, then 40% of jail should be white. It doesn't work that way. But they act as if that's the way it should be. And they spend all this time and all this effort to get people out of jail. And it has the opposite effect of what they want. And not only does it increase the percentage of minorities in jail, but it increases the number of minorities who are victims of crime because of all these people who were let out. And it's to me, it's mind-boggling. It really is.
Well, let's talk about a couple of data issues real quick that were not addressed in your report, but I've seen, and maybe you kind of have some anecdotal information on this, is your report didn't really talk about the failure to peer rate on bail. I mean, so there's other sorts of release, the ROR releases, the non-monetary releases. I think you referred to them as NMR. And there were still some bail releases there, but do we have any idea what the failure to peer rate on those is?
The failure to appear rate is kind of hard to look at because New York, when they did the bail laws, they changed, like for most misdemeanors and nonviolent, like felonies, which is a lower grade felony, police officers no longer bring somebody into court. They issue what's called a desk appearance ticket. And a lot of those people, if they have a prior record, a third of them don't even show up. So, I mean, the desk appearance failure rate used to be about 20%. Now it's about 30%. And if you take out particular crimes, it can be as high as 40 to 50%. So those people never show up. So they never work their way into the court data because the court data doesn't start until they're arraigned on the desk appearance ticket.
Okay.
If they never show up, their failure to appear is never included in the data. So they will look at the data. It's another trick that they do. They will look at the failure to appear data, and it's modestly increased, the failure to appear rate, but it doesn't include the 30% of people who never show up at all. And that's a good number of the people who disappear. So it's very difficult to make that comparison now.
Well, and if they don't show up for that, I mean, are they issuing warrants for failure to appear on those desk tickets, or they just
warrant for them and they go into a file?
Right. Now, I did an interview with Ken Good from the Texas Bail Association a few episodes ago, and he's been following up what's going on in Harris County because that was a big hotbed of bail reform in the O'Donnell case and stuff like that. He's been tracking some stuff where there's a website there that tracks that was showing an appearance rate in misdemeanor court in Harris County because that was where their bail reform was focused on misdemeanors. And they had a failure to appear rate in excess of 80%. On those misdemeanor cases, and they were seeing then the court's response to that was essentially dismissing cases. I mean, a lot of times what would happen in the area I'm in, okay, you missed court, well, then your case is just going to go into limbo while this warrant's sitting out here for you. And when we get you back, then we'll review the case. Apparently, according to him in Harris County, they're dismissing cases just so they don't have to keep processing them through. And they're on their misdemeanor cases, their dismissal rate is something like 80% now in Harris County, which is just crazy. But, I didn't know if you were seeing an increase in dismissals or if New York was handling those things, differently.
Well, on warrants, I don't think so. But where we're having problems, as I mentioned before, is on discovery. Because we're not, the DA's offices are not physically capable of complying with the new discovery laws, especially on misdemeanors. The dismissal rates have gone up to like 60% on dismissals on misdemeanor cases when the defendant shows up. I mean, I'm not talking about warrants. I'm just talking the DA cannot compile all the discovery data, all the police reports, all the videotapes, all that other stuff within the time frame set by the law. So those cases are being dismissed because the DAs can't answer ready within time. So that's where we're seeing dismissals like crazy down in criminal court. And the felony dismissal rate has gone up also.
Well, and you would think a good criminal defense attorney would be demanding that, okay, this is the letter of the law. You got to get this here. If we can't get it, got to dismiss. And they're like, I'm a hero to my client. I got your case dismissed.
They barely even have to demand it anymore because the judges are just doing it because it's law. It's what our law is.
I've got about 50 other things I could ask you about the report. And actually, I had notes here on all this other stuff, but we're running low on time. So let's just talk about future. Obviously, increased crime is a problem. No matter how much they want to gaslight us and tell us it's not happening. What can we do as going forward? What's the solution? How do we get past this problem?
Well, I look back and I think about. I go back to 2019, and I say, things were working pretty well back then. Crime down almost 27 years in a row. The jail population down 50, 60% in that time. And continuing to go down. Alternative sentencing programs, we had a lot of them. In Queens County alone, we had 27 different programs that we put people in. What was broken that we had to do this? and I mean, I know what has to be done. I mean, you have to allow judges to look at a defendant and determine, A, is he going to come back? B, is he a threat to the public? And C, is he going to reoffend if I let him out? And they should be allowed to do that on every single crime. I mean, you can have people charged with attempted murder who, are never going to reoffend. A 16, 17-year-old kid who gets in a fight and pulls a knife on somebody and swings. Well, that's theoretically, it's, but if he's got no prior record and he comes from an intact family and he's, there are a whole bunch of factors. He's never been in trouble before and all that sort of thing. Well, he's not going to be a threat. But there are people charged with shoplifting who were found with a knife on them, both of which are misdemeanors, but who's got a murder conviction and an attempted assault case, pending or something like that, who should be in jail, even though he's only charged with a misdemeanor. So, judges have to be able to look at everything. You can't just say you cannot set bail on this crime, no matter what the defendant did in the past. You have to go back to giving judges the discretion on any defendant, any crime, any time. And until you start doing that and allowing judges to consider public safety in setting bail conditions, it's not going to stop. And until you stop attacking police the way that you do, I don't mean you, of course, and politicians stop, trying to micromanage everything that goes on in the police department and attacking every incident where a police officer swings at somebody or uses force to stop somebody as a potential crime. Well, then you're not going to be able to get people into the police department who are motivated, who are dedicated, who are, are the kind of people that you want to have in the police department. And I mean, there's so many things that have to be done. We've just gone so far astray in looking at this. But those are some things that we have to start doing right away.
Change the narrative.
Yeah.
Get it back to a more common sense narrative.
Yeah.
Sad part of that is I had a legislature tell me years ago, it's really hard to legislate common sense.
It is. Yes, it is.
Well, Mr. Quinn, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. I would encourage everyone to go read your article. If you're interested in data-driven law enforcement, data-driven in courts, it's a great article. It really fills it out. I wish more people were doing this, and it wasn't just the same people that had a vested interest that were putting out these reports. So it was really refreshing to read that. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us, and thank you for writing the report.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
We want to thank our guest today, Jim Quinn, for taking the time to talk with us. His report, More Criminals, More Crime, Measuring the Public Safety Impact of New York's 2019 Bail Law, is available on the website of the Manhattan Institute. For anyone who wants to look at a data-driven approach to criminal justice, this should be required reading. We actually need more of this sort of information from unbiased sources. We hope you'll join us next time for another episode of the Bail in the Midwest podcast, and we will continue to try and bring you this sort of important information.
Join us again next time for the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf.